Well, thank you, Caroline, and great to be with you all. My name is Rob Perrilleon. I lead our delivery team at Corporate Visions, which just means all of the great consultants and writers and designers and facilitators who do work for our clients roll up to my organization. So great to be with you all. And just a quick disclaimer at the start. When you registered for this webinar, hopefully you're here for the great topic, the great discussion, and the great content. But you might have noticed that the webinar is going to be delivered by my dear friend and colleague, Leslie Talbot. And as you might have figured out, I am not Leslie Talbot. So if you are here because you're a Leslie fan, I get it. She's likable. And if you're feeling in that group like you've just sat down at a Broadway play and you get that little insert that the understudy is going to be playing the lead role tonight, I just have you know that I've collaborated with Leslie for years, including on all of the underlying IP and content that we're going to be talking about today. And so if you're willing to give it a go, I will do my best to fill those fabulous shoes. All right, and with that, the topic today is becoming a memorable marketer. And to set that discussion up, just to share a couple of quick stats to illustrate the dynamic that we're going to be talking about and the importance of this idea of memorability in marketing. And so this first number comes from a recent study, and there's been a series of these coming out over the last couple of years, but this one showed that B2B buyers are now getting around 80% of the information that they consume across their buying process from digital sources. Digital just meaning things other than a conversation, a live conversation with a seller. And so that obviously means that where are they getting their information if it's only 20% coming from those kind of direct conversations? Well, they're getting it from a whole bunch of other sources, some of which you control, some of you don't, but more and more they be coming from you, from marketing, right? And all the different campaigns and content and assets and information that you put out there. So increasing role of the information that you're putting out there is becoming increasingly visible, and an increasing share of the overall information that's consumed by buyers. Second statistic related to it now says that these days, typical B2B buying committee members only spend 17% of their time actually meeting with suppliers. So in the same vein as the first number, just keep in mind that 17% is total across all vendors. So if a typical scenario, maybe a buyer or a company is talking to 3 potential partners, what that effectively means, if you're one of those 3, is that you're getting 5, maybe 6% of the total buyer's time is direct conversation with you, which makes that information all the more important. It also raises the question of what information is being sent, what's the message that's coming across to those customers, especially in today's environment where, especially with complex solution selling, there's probably many stakeholders, even from your organization, that's influencing that conversation. And so the obvious consideration here is, how are these things aligned? How are your marketing programs, your demand gen campaigns, your ABM programs, other initiatives, your thought leadership, how is that aligned to and consistent with, yes, your sales channels and all of those other roles that may play a part in that overall customer conversation? We got customer success here. This is by no means exhaustive. You know, if you think about, and you're welcome to put in chat all of the other touch points that a buyer may have just with your organization. And the reason why this is so important is one way to undermine memorability, one way to be sure to not be memorable as an organization, is to send disjointed, inconsistent messages to the customer. That just means we know that the human brain, when it processes all this different types of messaging, it's just going to bog down and is not going to retain any of it. So the topic today, I would submit, is more important than ever in terms of being memorable to your buyers. I see a question in chat here from Peter. Is it 17% across all platforms or just face-to-face? Peter, I believe that's across all platforms. So face-to-face meetings could include, Zoom or in person like we're talking about today. All right, so the question then becomes, how do you become memorable? And if you know really anything about corporate visions, you probably know that our perspective on this is the best way to ensure consistency, memorability, and also to align on across all those different stakeholders from your organization, what is the right message to have to the market? Well, at Corporate Visions, we believe that the answer lies in understanding human decision-making psychology, how people, how buyers, after all, are humans, how people frame value and make choices, make decisions. Specifically in a B2B context, but you also know, if you know Corporate Visions, that we're constantly pushing that frontier forward with original research, inclusive of neuroscience studies, where our colleague runs a neuroscience lab, hooks people up to those helmets and literally reads the brain waves that are coming through in response to different stimuli, behavioral simulations. I won't go through it all, but cutting edge research done in conjunction with the top minds in the field, academic partners at top universities around the world. So we have something to say, and that's what you'll be hearing today, is some of those keys and triggers for becoming more memorable. One of the key findings from this body of research, and not just our own research at Corporate Visions, but there's a body of research that establishes this depressing statistic that you're seeing here on your screen, which is that in most interactions across different modalities, on average, people are going to remember only about 10% of what they hear. And believe me, everyone, I get the irony of sharing this at the beginning of a webinar, and I'm as depressed as you, knowing that you will probably remember very little of what we share today. But this is an important point to keep in mind. In a world where people are going to forget most of what they hear, it's important to then consider what to do about it. So one approach might be to see, how can you get that 10% retention up? And there are things that you can do to increase memorability. And we'll talk about some of those things today. But the reality is you're going to move it up incrementally, right? So that 10% may become 12, may become 15. It's not going to flip and become 90. And so a question I'm going to pose here, and that we'll come back to later, is maybe a different question, is if you assume that your audience is going to remember about 10% of what you convey, well, then the question becomes, what 10% are they remembering? Is it the 10% you want them to remember, or is it random? And in a world with multiple buying stakeholders, is there a consistent 10% across those stakeholders? Because nothing is going to bog down group decision-making more than everyone walking away with their own impression and remembering a different set of facts and information from those interactions. So that's a topic that we're going to come back to throughout our time today. And if we know that memory drives decision, and that's the main question here, we also know, just based on lots of experience reviewing B2B messaging, that a lot of it is often not memorable. And so what are some of the observations that we see at Corporate Visions? I would say probably number one, and things that we'll talk about today are, if you're going to be memorable to a buyer, you've got to meet them where they are. And this is particularly challenging, this idea of providing situational context. Let's face it, is more challenging for a marketer doing one-to-one communications than, for example, a seller with a one-on-one conversation. The good news is that there are ways of providing situation-specific context, even in a one-to-many scenario. And you'll hear a little bit about that in just a minute. And then you think about how you're bringing that message, those core messaging themes to life. Well, is your content memorable? And what can you do to increase the memorability of those key points in your content? Visuals are a key lever that you can use to drive memorability. How can you do that? And the story that you tell, right? That has a big role in how you tell that story to the market, and play a big role in driving consistency in that 10%, and even increasing the retention maybe from that 10%. And so that's the goal for today's session, is across those different categories, messaging, the core themes, the content that you're producing behind it, the story, inclusive of the storytelling and visuals, The goal here today is to maybe share a couple of ideas, a couple of nuggets that you can take away based on the research that we've done to become more memorable. So let's start with that idea of messaging and that idea of situational messaging. And how can you bring situational context to your buyer? I'm going to step away from like this topic for just a second. I actually just like ask you to do a thought experiment. I'm going to describe something. There will be a question at the end. So if you want to get your chat fingers ready, I'm going to have a follow-up question. But I want you to just for the moment, imagine that at the end of this webinar, maybe later today, you're driving around your neighborhood, wherever you are in the world, we've got a global group, and you notice that in your hometown, in your neighborhood, there's a home that's come up for sale. And it's a home that you've always admired. You've never been inside, but you've always admired it. So you're curious, you go home, you find the listing online. There are some pictures of the interior. And sure enough, it's every bit as charming on the inside as it is on the out. In fact, you're thinking to yourself, you know, if I'm being honest, I've got a little envy because this is a little nicer than where I live. You happen to notice that the price, if you were on the market, would be something that you could afford, right? So if you've got that in mind, almost all the time, the way that story ends is you say, oh, that's interesting. Someone's going to wind up with a great home in this neighborhood. Meaning, what almost never happens at the end of this story is that you immediately put your own home up for sale and go buy the other one. Even though in this little thought experiment, we said that it is a little nicer than where you live today, and price was not a non-starter. So the question that I have for you, and I'd love to get your reactions in chat, is why is that? Why don't we move every year, every 6 months, whenever it is we find something that's a little nicer? And for most of us, I believe that's a realistic scenario. If you're living in your dream home, congratulations. But for most of us, with maybe a little work, we could probably find something that's a little bit nicer than where we live today and something that we could afford. So put those chat. I'm just interested in your feedback. What holds you back from moving all the time? I already see some responses. Too much work, change burden, status quo, change is hard. That's great stuff. Inertia. I'd rather burn my house down than pack up everything and move in it. Great answer. That's Peter. The hassle. So we've got several references. Switching costs. Great. So the act of moving, hate packing, risk averse, fear, all those things are right. Dan's got taxes, all good stuff. So folks, some of you made reference to a key topic or a key concept that really explains that phenomena, and that is the status quo bias. And some of you made reference to that. This is just people's natural resistance to change and people's bias in any number of scenarios, bias towards sticking with their status quo. And that's a really important factor here. Now, this idea of the status quo itself is well established in the literature. It's not proprietary to CVI. But what we have done is extended that concept and done some original research on how this applies specifically to B2B messaging. And what you're seeing on the screen here is some of the academic terms for the underlying root causes of status quo bias. And it doesn't matter what these academic terms are, you just define them. And so just a quick grounding on this, when you were talking about things like taxes and the work of moving, you were talking about the cost of change. When you were talking about the fear of the unknown, I see Gina has put that through. You're talking about anticipated regret and blame, which is really just all about risk. So cost of change is what is this going to cost? That could be money, fees, realtor costs, all those things, as well as time, effort, packing, all those things. Anticipated regret is what could go wrong. What if we don't like the neighbors? What if the roof leaks? All those things. Preference stability would be things like we're not on the market. When we chose the place we currently live in, we looked at a lot of options and we chose this one. And so preference stability is just saying, I don't want to go revisit a question that I've already thought about. And then selection difficulty is this idea that, well, is there really a compelling reason to make the change? Meaning, yeah, this place is great. It's not perfect. Our place maybe isn't perfect, but we've done some things to make it our own. And so is there, really a compelling reason to make the switch or not? So you defined all of that. Now, if you think about this, here's the connection to the topic at hand, folks, is in the same way that you were just presented with a scenario that offered you a better solution, for lack of a better term, at a price that you could afford, you still walked yourself out of that decision, right? Because for all of these status quo bias reasons. And folks, that is how people process change. And B2B buyers are people as well. And that is why so often, even when presented with a solution that would objectively leave them in a better place and give them gains, B2B buyers so often resist the change, avoid the change, and talk themselves out of it. And so that's why this is a key factor in providing that situational messaging, understanding what role you play in that prospect's status quo. And so the practical application here is based on some original research that we did at Corporate Visions. The messaging for acquiring new prospects is just simply not the same as the messaging that would be most effective in marketing to existing customers. And the reason for that is that status quo bias. And if you think about it, when you are talking to a prospect, you are not part of their status quo. And all of those factors, all of that resistance are going to come into play, even if they acknowledge and recognize the benefits of your solution. And so a big part of your messaging, especially early stage, top of funnel, if you're doing that kind of demand gen type of work, your message has to be super disruptive to that status quo. You've got to answer the question, why do they need to change their operation at all? Never mind which vendor they choose, but why should they do anything differently? You got to overcome that status quo bias first and foremost. But, and here's the big finding, when you're talking or messaging to an existing customer, well, now you are part of their status quo. And all of those headwinds become tailwinds. And so even if you're trying to grow your relationship, you want to take advantage of that status quo bias and reinforce situation specific, but reinforce your role in that status quo bias. This difference is so stark that in our research, what we found was that if you take that super disruptive acquisition, new prospect, new logo acquisition type message and bring that to an existing customer, not only is it suboptimal, it actually leads to increased risk of churn. We saw results like increased willingness to entertain competitive offers, increased willingness to switch. And so you can be, if done wrong, if you're taking a one-size-fits-all approach to your messaging, not only you're becoming less memorable, but you could actually be doing harm to your existing customer relationships. The difference was that stark. And so some natural questions come out of this as marketers is, are you providing different messaging to different segments, prospects and versus customers? Love to hear some feedback in the chat if you have it. Do you take a different approach to prospects versus customers? Your marketing efforts and campaigns different? If they are, great. Congratulations. We'll talk a little bit more next about the grounding and the context on how to do that. What should those messaging approaches be for all those different segments? We're going to start with the idea of what is the optimal messaging for acquiring for marketing to new prospects, so customers, logos that you're trying to acquire. Okay, and folks, I'm going to give you a couple of frameworks here to guide your messaging in your marketing efforts. Just for time's sake, it's going to have to be a pretty quick flyby. We do post tons of further follow-on information up on our website. So if something catches your attention, just know that you can find lots more detail on the Corporate Visions homepage. So when you're talking to a messaging to a prospect, context matters. So here's the 5-step. This is based on original research we did with a professor at Stanford University. The first step is to meet the customer where they are and provide context by talking about the trends, the developments, the evolving pressures, how things are changing in the customer's environment. Always customer first. That's going to provide context. To be memorable, you got to meet them where they are to gain their attention. From here, the next steps, I think you'll start to see some ties to some of those psychological triggers that you just heard about in that status quo bias. So the kind of general story arc here is your next move, after just talking about some of the changes happening in that prospect's world, is to talk about how, in light of those changes, some of the current approaches that companies, organizations like them are taking are going to start to fall down, are going to open up gaps and to open up gaps to achieve their business goals. So you're going to be talking about how those approaches, current state approaches and strategies, are going to prove to be flawed as these trends continue. And you're going to talk not only about why they're flawed, but what are some of the negative outcomes. Tone matters. You'll do this with the right nuance, but you'll talk about how those approaches are becoming flawed, are opening up risk, and the negative consequences that will result if they don't make a change. What you're trying to do here is invoke that risk aversion, that loss aversion, that cost of change that you heard about. But here, you're flipping it around to say, if you think about most people, most buyers are going to associate all of that risk and loss and cost with making a change. Here, you're posing the question, what's the risk, the loss, the cost of not changing? And if their world is changing, then probably stands to reason that not changing their strategy and response probably does have some risk, probably does have some potential costs. So you're invoking some of those same triggers that you just heard about. Your next move then is to provide contrast. Important concept here. Clear and stark contrast between continue unchanged with their status quo versus what they can do differently if they take a different approach. And the important thing here is you want to talk about the business impact in terms that they are going to care about, but you have to go a little bit deeper than just talking about high-level business outcomes like saving time, saving money, reducing risk, increasing revenue, whatever the benefits of your solution are. You want to talk about them, but you need to provide a little bit more specificity. Talking about business impact alone is going to make you sound like everyone else, right? Because let's face it, you and all of your competitive set are at least talking about and promising the same set of high-level business impact. The key question that a buyer needs to understand is how. How are you going to provide and lead to those outcomes differently and better than the other alternatives that they may be considering? And so some specificity in what that strategy would look like. The key terms here is describing, making crystal clear to that buyer what they're going to be able to do differently working with you. And that level of specificity is going to paint a clear picture, which is going to in turn help you be more memorable when they're considering their options. All right. Pause here and see. So this is the high-level messaging framework. I know it's kind of a flyby for acquiring new prospects. I see one question from Lawson in the chat. Different messaging works against claiming a position because it fails to take advantage of the power of consistency and reputation. So Lawson's saying different messaging works against claiming a position. If you have a different message for buyers and a different one for customers, which one is your position? So Lawson, I think I'm understanding the question. If you're saying, how does that, what happens to consistency of message? And what I would say between a prospect and a customer, if you're offering different messaging approaches. And also what I would say is the key claims that you're making about your solution are going to be the same. It's a question of the messaging having the context about where they're starting. So if someone is not working with your organization at all, they need to just get a different set of information because they haven't had any lived experience about what that solution means to them. if they have been working for you a while, they have a different set of information, they have a different set of inputs, and so your messaging should adjust. So it's the same core claims, it's the context that you use to meet that prospect or customer where they are that we're talking about, leveraging some of the psychology that you got here. Folks, welcome any other questions that you have as we go. So if that was what you just saw was the prospecting key messaging architecture, I'm going to paint the picture here of the exact opposite. So here's a situation where, as we term the why stay message, which is talking and messaging to existing customers, but specifically, we've identified at Corporate Visions 3 main scenarios that require different context for the target. You just saw the acquiring new prospects messaging framework. And then the second one is here is the exact opposite of that, is existing customers, specifically where there's a churn problem. So if you've got a situation where your customer attrition is too high, your customer turnover is too high, and you're looking to first and foremost lessen that and retain more customers, that's what we're talking about here. And just as a preview, next one the third one that I'll cover is a upsell, cross-sell type of growth play within an existing customer. But here, we're talking about what happens if you've got more higher attrition that you want. What would that look like? The interesting thing about this messaging architecture is that in a lot of ways, it's exactly the opposite in context of the acquisition message that you just heard. Let's take a look at what that means. Because if you think about it, you're now part of this customer status quo. And so how does the messaging and the context look different? So the first thing that you want to do in this approach is start by just touching on the value that that customer has seen or is likely to have seen to date from the partnership. That's building your incumbent advantage and reminding them of your position in their status quo. And if you think about, now this is a little bit harder to do when you're doing one-to-many marketing, but there's certainly things that you can do as a marketer. You can be sharing customer case studies, testimonials, showing value that customers have gotten. If you've got access to kind of aggregated data of typical results and value that customers realize when working with you, all of those things reinforce that value of the partnership with existing customers. From here, you now want to start to hit some of those triggers that we talked about and reinforce that status quo bias. So in some ways, subtle ways, you want to just remind them that the decision that they made to select you was a good one. What you're trying to do here is invoke that preference stability that you heard about earlier. From there, you're going to think about that same risk and cost of change that you heard about earlier. And in some ways, you want to be explicit about that. How explicit? Context matters, is up to you. But the research shows that over the course of a relationship, customers will tend to assume that the results that they've seen up to date are guaranteed and locked in, and they undercount, in some ways, the risk and the cost of making a change. And so you just want to remind them of that, because it is real that some of those outcomes, if they were to rip you out and go with an alternative provider, that some of those results may actually be at risk. Again, tone matters. How you do that, how you convey that is editorial choices. But the research is clear that reminding of that at some level is going to be really important and impactful. And here you're going to just remind them as well that you're an innovative company. You keep your solution and capabilities up to date. So everything that they would expect and need, they will get from you. What you're trying to invoke here is that idea of selection difficulty. And what's interesting here around selection difficulty, the selection difficulty just says as a concept that in the absence of clear contrast between my choices, I'm just going to stick with the status quo. I'm going to stick with what I've been doing. In other words, I need a really compelling difference. I need to see a really compelling difference between my choices in order to do something different. In this scenario, and this is counterintuitive, folks, but in this scenario, when you are the incumbent, you're trying to reduce churn. One outcome of selection difficulty is all you need to do it's okay if all you need to do is if that customer concludes that, you know what, there's just really not a lot of difference between my current provider, you, and the other choices I might be entertaining, they're going to be predisposed to stick with you. Now that's counterintuitive as a marketer because you spend so much time trying to establish your differentiation, and you need to do that and provide that clear contrast in a prospect messaging. And it's not saying don't provide a differentiation if you have it, of course do that. But it just means that the bar here with an existing customer is a little bit lower because the tie if there's a perceptual tie, the incumbent wins out. And if that's you, getting them to just realize there's not any compelling difference to switch away from you is actually going to be good enough. And that was a really interesting finding from this research, right? So now you got those contrasting visions. This is the customer retention type of messaging framework, and you just had the prospect acquisition type of messaging framework. I would venture to guess, and love to get any reactions in the chat, there is a third scenario that is often the focus of a lot of marketing strategies, which is growth within existing customers. Now, the interesting thing about that framework and that approach is situationally, that's a little bit of a hybrid between the two approaches that you just saw, right? Because you are part of their status quo, so you've got some incumbent advantage, but you're also trying to get them to make a change, to do more, to consume more with you. And so the approach here, the messaging approach, is a bit of a hybrid as well. You're going to start out with the same move that you did in Why Stay, which is establish that incumbent advantage, just like we talked about before. That's, again, really important, it carries a lot of weight, because the next thing you're going to do is make a case for change to that customer. And so it's really important that you do that kind of having established and strengthened that incumbent advantage, reminded them of the value that they're getting to date. Because the risk here is similar to what you heard me say earlier. You don't want to be too disruptive in this move with an existing customer, because the danger here and the nuance in this messaging strategy is if you're too disruptive, you could disrupt yourself out of the relationship. That was those findings that we found with increased willingness to switch in an overly disruptive message. Meaning, you don't want to paint the picture that tells that customer you need radical changes in your strategy when you are part of their status quo, when they're an existing customer. Why? Because they might conclude, you're right, I do need big changes, and if I've got to make big changes, I might as well just look at all my alternatives. So the nuance here in this approach, it's got some similar themes that you saw in the prospect acquisition why change strategy, but you're dialing down the disruptiveness. So you are going to talk about some changes in their environment, but they're not going to be lightning kind of thunderbolt changes. They're going to be evolving changes, expected changes. We use this term hard truth just to show that the hard truth says telling your existing customer that their status quo, which you are part of, is going to start to break down as their environment, as these trends continue. And we say that hard truth just because there's a little bit of vulnerability there that says, I'm coming to you with the fact that we need to make some changes in your approach, even though I've helped you build the situation and the strategy that you have in place today. So just a little bit of vulnerability, but there's great credit there for a true partnership when you're able to make that case. So the high-level strategy is document those results, talk about some of the changes that you've expected, evolving type of changes, not revolutionary, but evolutionary type changes in their environment. Talk about, well, those changes are going to require some adjustments to the strategy. You can't do nothing, otherwise there's some risk evolving. But this isn't burn it all down and build it from the ground up. This is evolutionary change. And then you can be specific about what that would represent and what your enhanced capabilities, whatever the upsell, cross-sell strategy would be here. So in this why evolve scenario, increased spend with existing customers, you're doing a bit of a hybrid approach between that super disruptive why change and that really reinforce the status quo retention, why, stay, play. So 3 scenarios, 3 different ways of building context in your messaging by using those different frameworks. By the way, all those frameworks and templates that you're seeing here will be available after the webinar, so that you can download them and apply them in your messaging strategies. All right, so we're going to move on now. If you've got the core messaging themes established, and now we're going to look at how can you influence and how can you tell that story through the content that you're producing as a marketer. Again, any questions that you have, just put them through chat. But going back, where I'll start is going back to that concept that you heard earlier, that key finding that the typical audience is going to remember 10% of what they heard. That posing that question, is it the right 10%? Are they going to come away with the 10% that you want them to retain? The ones that's the 10% of information that's going to be most leveraged in helping them decide to make a choice and make that choice with you. And so we use the term in corporate visions, what is your 10% message? If you can do no better, what's the 10% that you want them, that you need them to take away from any exposure, any marketing campaign, any piece of content that they see? The key elements of a 10% message, 3 simple hallmarks. The first is that it should be simple. It should be short. Information overload goes directly against memorability. It should be action-oriented. So you'll see some examples of this in a second. And a great 10% message should promise some kind of reward. Reward could just be simply provoking or invoking curiosity, wanting to find out more information, how I can achieve a certain benefit or end state, any of those things. But simple, action-oriented, and promise a reward. Stacy, there will be a recording of this, so you will be able to review this. This will go out to all attendees here. So let's take some examples I've got some before and after examples. Using some slide examples, you could use this same concept applies in any content asset if you're producing ebooks, social media posts, really anything. The idea of a 10% message. So here's some before and after. A simple meeting agenda, if you're producing messaging, if you're producing the messaging decks for your sellers, this is a great early exposure to establish that 10% message right from the get-go. And you see the contrast here between in the before, maybe it passes the test of simple, not much action and not much reward here. Contrast that to the after, and it's still really the same pieces of information. So it's still simple. Experience, you're just seeing more verbs, right? So more action oriented. And there is some subtle reward in here in terms of, well, my curiosity is provoked. I'd like to see how I could onboard a strategic supplier easily and quickly. I can go right down the list. And when I say offer reward, it could be as simple as that. Is there something that makes me curious to want to hear more? That's the hallmark of a great 10% message. Here's another simple example, just before and after. So you're just saying, instead of just a couple of things, invoking some curiosity, I want to be like that. I want to stop worrying and embrace the cloud, right? A little more curiosity provoking here, still remaining simple. So you got a couple of examples there. Think about your 10% message. What do you want your customer to remember? It should be, again, about them, action-oriented, promise a reward. Then the question is, how do you reinforce and drive retention of that 10%? The simplest but most effective way of reinforcing that 10% message is to simply repeat it. And probably repeat it more times than you think you should. We've done some studies around exposures across a simple message and about what drives the most retention. How many repetitions of a 10% maximize retention while stopping short of being irritating, right? Because that's always the concern. If this is every other slide, people are going to just start to get annoyed. And the results were surprising. Way more exposures than you think did not become an annoyance and actually increased repetition. You're going to see, and we'll play a little game if you can spot the 10% slide in the presentation that I'm using here, because you're going to see it repeated a bunch of times. So simple, and there's the answer. Look for that slide. That's the 10% slide that I'm using to kind of peek behind the curtain, and you're going to see this still several more times. Repeat that 10% message. Once you establish it, think about it. What do you want that customer to or prospect to remember from any exposure, any marketing campaign, any content asset that they see from you? How can you repeat it, drive that memorability? So is there any questions about content? Simple concept here, a lot more to be said, but the simple nugget is think about that 10% message. What do you need them to remember about you? And just as an example there, that could be as simple as if you're marketing to an existing, to a new prospect, that 10% message, if you really think about what's important, it's probably not any details at the early stage, kind of top of funnel marketing exposures. You probably don't need them to remember any details about your solution. In fact, you probably don't need them to remember that much about your solution at all, I would submit. Your 10% might be as simple as, we've got an emerging challenge that I need to pay attention to, and XYZ company has something that will help. In that early stage, it might be as simple as that. If that's what they remember to get through to the next exposure to find out more, that 10% message will change across the buying journey. So just think about at each step, what do you need them to remember to proceed to the next? And then really be simple and clear about that and repeat it to drive that retention. Okay. I'm going to take a quick look at some visuals as well, because visuals we know are a key element in driving memorability as well. And so I'm going to take a couple of examples here about what drives retention and what kind of inspires people to take action in terms of visuals. And because we're talking about visuals, I'm going to give just a couple of key concepts and then show a couple of examples. Now, obviously, it probably no surprise when we say bullet lists and boxes are not compelling. So in terms of a visual, that's not much going on in a slide like this. We'll look at how you can change that. Now, I will say that there are some times where you do need to convey a lot of information. And so sometimes information dense is okay. Our neuroscientist colleague, Dr. Carmen Simon, always says that the human brain is more than capable of handling complexity. The key to memorability is how you manage the complexity for your audience. So instead of throwing up a wall of words at one point, a slight visual approach that will change that is think about how you're just managing out builds and animations so that you're staging the complexity in bite-sized chunks. So when you can avoid bullet lists and boxes, you want to do that with more compelling visuals. But when it comes time where you have to, and that's okay, just think about how you're staging and managing the complexity for your audience. So second theme here is, this second example looks like it's a whole lot more visual than the first, and that's true. But we've got a lot of emerging research that says those cliche or generic images, while they're visual, they don't move the needle at all. So you want to be real careful about that. And we'll share some examples as well. And then visuals for the sake of visuals without a lot of relevance are also not going to move the needle. So chevrons, I guess, are okay in this example, but they're really not doing much to advance the story. So you have to ask the question, maybe you can argue that that's a visual approach, but it's not one that's doing anything to drive increased memorability. So it's one thing to get away from bullets and words, but the context of the visual, the approach matters. So the question then really becomes, how do you inspire action through your visuals to make them memorable? And I think the simplest way to do that is to just show some examples. So do you have a visual treatment here? Here's a before and after. Not really. There's a couple of bullets here, but here's an example of just putting some relevant contextual visuals. Here, if we're talking about different types of buyers, shopaholics and impulsive visuals, stylish enthusiasts, the visuals here are relevant because they're just showing and conveying more than the words will by themselves. So simple approaches. Again, the key here is these aren't generic images. These are relevant to the point that you're making, but they're showing some subtle differences. So just some visual approach there, enhancements will make a difference. Here is that example of that generic visual. So happy business people looking at phones, at screens, really common trope that we see in lots of messaging. And folks, they just don't move the needle. So how can you change that? Well, here's an example of a slide that we worked on. Same information on the page. The visual here was more relevant to the story. So instead of a business person generically looking at a screen, the context of this message was, we're saying your journey as a customer is constantly unfolding. And we use that unfolding idea to do an origami type visual here. Not that that's the only choice here, that there's a simple formula, but thinking about what's the message that you're trying to convey and how can you use the visual to enhance or reinforce that message to drive memorability. And again, last example here is going from just simple words on slide. That certainly passes the simple context, but what can you do to enhance and provide maybe an unexpected visual? If you're trying to drive memorability, one of the most common ways of doing that is kind of breaking the familiar pattern. And so I want to talk about this example in particular where, there might be a brand standard, kind of brand standard slide template that you're using in like the before example, and that's going to have a lot of value. So I'm not here to trash our friends in brand marketing at all. In fact, the consistency that you're conveying through your brand is really, really important. At very select moments, though, when you're approaching a moment, one of those 10% moments of a key takeaway, one of the most important things that you can do is break that familiar pattern, because the human brain craves detecting differences. And when it sees one, it's suddenly going to jump into, it's going to light up, and all those neurons are going to fire. You're going to have much more memorability at this key moments. And the important part here is the interplay. It's the consistency of the brand standard that is going to allow for, in those very select moments when you break the pattern, for it to be that memorable. So you're kind of getting a 2-for here. We all know that the consistency is going to help memorability. The consistency of a brand standard is going to help memorability through that consistency. And it gives you the opportunity, again, used selectively, to break that pattern, to get a spike in that memorability. And we can see that spike in our brain lab when we have people hooked up to the EKG monitors. When you break the pattern, really good things happen. All right, here's one last example. Just thinking about, again, getting away from just generic tech images and really thinking about something, a visual that's memorable and specific to your audience. So this is much more of a interesting, provocative visual, but if the question posed in both the before and after is, who is your audience? A generic phone image is not going to cut it. Maybe give an image that evokes who that audience is. So again, having the visual support the message and not just be eye candy is going to be really important here. All right, and then last tip here is, don't be afraid of some emotion. Here's a way of doing that, again, selectively, but emotion we know drives brain activity and is inextricably tied to retention. And so just a simple visual that provides a human connection. And here's one that can be done within brand context standards as well. So not everything has to break the pattern, but you can do that, and don't be afraid of a little bit of emotion, a little bit of humanity in your slides. Again, in service of the message, not just for visual appeal's sake and aesthetics, but here reinforcing that message. So I know, again, that was a pretty quick flyby of visuals, but the key takeaways on visuals are, use them. They can play a huge role in memorability. Get away from generic images. Think about what's the message that you're trying to convey. Those visuals should enforce that. I'm sure some of you are thinking that's a pretty straightforward and simple point, Rob, but what I will tell you is that we see over and over again, simple on paper, often missed in execution. And so really ask your designers and your design team the tough questions of, how does this visual, even if it's aesthetically beautiful, does it really help forward the message? And in those key retention moments, are you doing a visual that can break a familiar pattern to spike up that attention and reinforce the point, that 10% point that you're making? All right. The last concept here is the story that you tell. So we've talked about the pictures. What's the words behind the pictures? And great messaging is a mix of science and art. And we've talked a lot about the science throughout this, but the art of storytelling matters. What we see over and over again If something happens in business communications that just strip out all of the elements that we know outside of our business life, makes for compelling and memorable stories. And it's kind of hard to explain why that happens. I don't know why it happens, but it just does over and over. Because folks, we know what makes for compelling stories. There's some academic research that talks about perceptive, cognitive, and affective triggers. And you can see some of what that means here. That's fairly academic, but literally things like the human brain in a great story is going to react to the literal sensory impressions. You can bring this into your marketing, messaging, and campaigns. What does it look like? What does it sound like? Can you paint some relevant details that allow someone to really visualize themselves in your context? A great story always has action, always has a protagonist, always has action across time. Those things are so often stripped out of corporate communications. Time to put those back in. Emotions, values, motivations, those speak to human behavior. Very, very compelling. How often are they left out because we somehow think that when we get into the business world, we're thinking about just the facts and we have to make objective, fact-based decisions. Numbers, quantified data, they all have their place. But what the research says, what the brain science says, is that data, ROI, calculators, all of that quantitative information, they don't trigger human decision-making. Human decision-making happens at that more basic emotional, intuitive level. The data, the facts, the figures, they play an important role, but they play the role of helping the person rationalize, justify, and explain their decision to others. But the decision itself is happening at this deeper level in the brain. So you want to use the quantitative and the qualitative, but just recognize where that decision is being made. And there are models for effective storytelling. So in the few minutes we have left, I'll leave you with a storytelling model. This is not Corporate Vision's proprietary. This is based on the work of Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey. I'm sure some of you have seen that. And if you're familiar with it, very compelling model. If you don't know Joseph Campbell, he studied storytelling and myths throughout human history and around the world. If you're not familiar with his work, you're probably familiar with people who he's influenced. George Lucas gave him a screen credit for the original Star Wars because he modeled it. He based the screenplay off of this storytelling model that Campbell came up with. He called his book The Hero with a Thousand Faces because as he studied stories and myths across human history and around the world, he found certain storytelling models came up over and over again. And so this hero's journey is something that came up 1,000 different ways and shapes, but it's got a familiar story arc that I'll share with you here. As I do this, it's a pretty complex model. We've simplified it here into 5 simple steps. As I share these steps, I just want you to have in mind your favorite story. That could be an action movie, a novel, a myth, a cultural story, even a religious parable, graphic novel, whatever it is. See if you can recognize this pattern. So the first step in the model is that the story opens where the world is normal. And then something changes in the world. There's a change event. At first, the hero of the story struggles, has some false starts, doesn't know how to proceed. And then a mentor emerges in the story. And that mentor helps guide the hero, who ultimately accepts the quest and saves the day. Now, if you've been thinking about whether it's the Odyssey or the Wizard of Oz or Harry Potter or anything, you probably see that story model come over and over again. But this can also be applied to corporate communications and marketing as well. Because all the elements you hear and all the things that we talked about, your customer's world is changing. And so what was normal and what was static for them is now changing. And it's natural for them, the customer, the hero, to struggle with that change and not be sure what to do. Important point here, you're then guidant, you're the mentor that's going to emerge and help guide them through those choices so that they can ultimately accept the quest and save the day. Now, I'm taking a little liberty with storytelling. Maybe it's not going to be that over the top in your marketing communications. but the elements are all there. And so think about, what are the changes, what are the struggles that your customer's dealing with, and how you can help guide them, not be the hero yourself, but be that mentor who helps guide them. One simple tip I want to leave you with here is, in terms of making the customer the hero, so often we hear communications that make the vendor, the seller, the marketer, the hero. And what I mean by that is, when you're thinking it, when you're hearing messages that say, we, provider, will solve these problems for you. Our solution solves these problems for you. What I would submit is, that's you being the hero. That's your solution, your company being the hero. A very simple word change can flip that dynamic to make your customer the hero. And as simple as flipping from our solution will solve these problems for you to, with our solution, you will be able to solve these problems. That sounds like a subtle shift. It is in word count, but it's enormously impactful in the psychology of the buyer and helping them visualize. Because let's face it, everyone wants to be the hero of their own story. All right. And so you can use those stories, again, as a way to spike up attention when you're repeating that 10% message. It's a great way of capturing attention and driving that memorability. Right. So we're about out of time here, folks, but hopefully across these different categories, you've taken just a couple of nuggets away, things and tools and ideas that you can help apply to become more memorable. And the last thing I'll say is, by the way, if you're keeping count at home, I repeated our 10% message here, which you see repeated here. I believe it was 10 times throughout. And so hopefully it didn't become an annoyance to you, but in terms of reinforcing the idea of that 10% message, you can probably repeat more times than you think. It was fully a quarter of the slides here were repeats of that 10% message. So don't be afraid to establish your 10%, repeat it, and drive it home. Folks, thanks for your time today. We're about out of time. What you're seeing here on the screen is there is a webinar recording that'll go out to all of you. There's also a link here if you want to capture it. This slide deck will go out to everyone, but you'll be able to download if you're interested in learning more. We've got an ebook available for everyone who's attended. With that, folks, I want to wish you the best. Thanks for spending some time with us, and all the best in your day.